This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this week a special edition, a special report on Ferguson, USA. You know, it was striking this week when the horrific tragedy happened, the death of James Foley, the United States journalist who was horrifically murdered by the ISIS or ISIS group in the Middle East. It got nationwide headlines, but black children are being murdered across the country. Those do not get headlines. This is meant in no way to diminish the horrific suffering and death of Mr. Foley, but it is to point out something that struck me very much, that President Obama came in for a great deal of criticism from the left, or I should say from Democrats anyway, as well as the right, and commentators like Ezra Klein, when he played golf after discussing Mr. Foley's death on national television. It was felt somehow that it was inappropriate for the President of the United States to go golfing 2 days in a row while a tragedy like that was taking place. Now, I'm not going to judge the President one way or another for going out to golf. What I will say is this. It struck me that there was no criticism that the President of the United States or the governor of Missouri or anybody else might choose to go play golf while young African-American men are being gunned down in the street, while demonstrators are being attacked with CS gas and tear gas and military-type weaponry. And it would certainly appear to the outside observers that unnecessary police violence was being wreaked on everyone who tries to assemble or report on the incidents in Ferguson, including, of course, our own journalists, Peter Callahan and Seth Jackson. So it's very striking to me as we look back over this past week that no one thought fit to, perhaps, if they're in a mood to criticize the president, which I'll refrain from doing in this particular instance, why no one saw fit to criticize the president for golfing while there was turmoil and what appears to be excessive police, out-of-control police behavior on the streets of an American city. So if you want to criticize, again, I'd say I have no, the Foley tragedy was terrible. It's going to take a lot of national discussion to figure out what to do about that. But if you want to criticize America's leaders for golfing on the job while there's a tragedy taking place, it is striking to me that that doesn't include the tragedy in Ferguson, including in some people's minds, in the media and in the Democratic Party and in the liberal, supportive, pro-Obama wing of the party. I would ask that people recognize the tragedy in Ferguson as being a national event, one that reflects on all of us, one that reflects on our philosophy of police protection, our philosophy of militarization, our philosophy of treating the children, young people, and peacefully protesting citizens of our own cities as if they were an alien force to be occupied rather than our friends and neighbors with whom we should be having dialogue and coming to mutual agreement. And I would also say this, there's been a lot of discussion about whether the police are over-militarized. I would argue that, yes, they certainly are, that there are many reasons for that, economic and political, financial, that the defense contractors benefit greatly from the militarization of our police forces. You've heard a lot of talk about this, I believe it's called the 1033 program, in which surplus overseas military equipment is given to our police forces. That's a part of it. The bigger part of it is the many billions of dollars being spent by the Department of Homeland Security to militarize our police forces. Is this the best way to keep us safe? Evidence suggests no. And what's more, even the militarization is incomplete, because when the U.S. military is given this kind of equipment and asked to go into tense political situations, which is what this is, upset communities, distressed communities, which is what Ferguson is, there are definite rules for how to do that. Our police are not trained in that. They're not following them. So I think we have a two-stage problem. The first stage is this. We do not train our police in using this equipment. The second stage is this. The very premise on which this equipment is being given, I would argue, is mistaken. Now, the U.S. Army Manual for situations such as the one in Ferguson, demonstrations and protests, strictly calls for what is described as a graduated response, with force being the very last step to be taken. Now, the guide says this: planning should focus on the prevention of unfavorable outcomes. Experience has shown that some law enforcement agencies attempting to help crowds accomplish their goals within the law has been beneficial. Now, the crowds in Ferguson have not. We'll be talking to guests on this special Ferguson USA edition about the goals of that crowd, but they've been very reasonable. They have been full disclosure of all information on the death of Michael Brown, a review of the police procedures to be used in situations such as this, a review of the Ferguson police in past events, and an investigation of the officer who instead has been allowed to leave town, apparently with pay. So, law enforcement agencies should maintain a law enforcement presence, but of course that can mean many things. The guide strictly tells personnel to avoid confrontation. That's the language. Avoid confrontation. Crowd resistance. I'm reading from the U.S. Army Manual again. Crowd situations are highly unpredictable, but history has proven that confrontation will most likely cause crowd resistance. Hello. When pushed, people tend to resist opposition to the realization of their purposes. And when their purposes are this is me talking now, of course, when the purposes are the protection of their children, they get very upset. The manual says, take precautions to avoid becoming a catalyst to the civil disturbance, which is exactly what our police have failed to do. In Ferguson, I would argue instead that they are a very direct catalyst. I will close by saying the police in Ferguson have used tear gas, and I'm reading from a summary of this, a type of nerve gas banned for use in warfare by the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993. They used CS gas on our own P. Callahan, and of course other journalists and demonstrators as well. We have a situation that is out of control in Ferguson, and while it has been peaceful for the last couple of nights, it is by no means over. We will be talking about what the people of Ferguson want, what this situation means, and how we can learn from it going forward. We will begin with our good friend Cliff Schechter, the commentator, writer, and media advisor, who has recently written about what I would describe as the hypocrisy of the right on this issue. But before that, some messages. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. Please stick with us. This is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. Our friend Cliff Schechter has asked what I believe to be the rhetorical question, certainly of the month, perhaps of the year. Cliff is an author, pundit, and public relations strategist whose firm Libertas LLC handles media relations for political, corporate, and nonprofit clients. But I know from personal experience with Cliff, only the good guys. And he has written extensively and spoken extensively on the issue of gun control. And Cliff asks what I consider to be an outstanding and deeply, profoundly rhetorical question, which is, why isn't the National Rifle Association standing up for the people of Ferguson? Cliff, are you with us?
I'm here. Thanks for having me on, RJ. I appreciate it, man.
It's always great to have you on. It's always great to have your point of view. And, this is something that's kind of been percolating for a while now, which is, hey, we hear all these, when Cliven Bundy goes out there and he's a nut and he just doesn't want to pay his grazing fees because he's a cheap bastard. And he, that maybe he puts some political rhetoric around it and he attracts a group of other nuts and they're packing guns and they're a danger to law and order. And some of the people there are threatening to harm law enforcement officers and everything else. Oh, the NRA, all these guys seem to be all over it. As you point out, Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, even called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms jackbooted thugs. And yet when the peaceful protests, largely peaceful, I mean, there've been a little rock throwing or something, but when the peaceful protesters of Ferguson get tear gassed, or reporters get beaten up and arrested, or whatever else might happen, or not to mention the death of young black people on the streets, we don't hear a lot about staying away from the federal government or the rights of people or anything like that from the NRA. And gosh, why is that?
I don't know. It's almost like the people who are the victims in Ferguson look different than the people that are in the NRA or something, RJ. I mean, in all seriousness, yeah, of course, like so much that's going on, it's about race. I wrote about it in this piece that when I went to the NRA convention in Indianapolis a few months ago, I saw so few African American faces in the audience. I mean, there probably were more at your average RNC convention. Certainly, as I said, on an average episode of the Dukes of Hazzard, there were more African American faces. The Wayne LaPierre constantly talks about things that are just dog whistles to anybody who follows politics, things that are made up terms from Fox, like knockout gamers, and brings up drug cartels and terrorists and all sorts of things that we know aren't giving the people he's talking to images of white people doing these kinds of things. These are the reasons. He's even gone as so far as to say Latino gangs. So every once in a while he comes out and says some of the things that he's implying. And then there's the NRA board. I mean, I'm sure everybody's heard way too much from Ted Nugent, that's racist. But even some of the lesser-known members of the board if you go through their statements, you'll find support for apartheid in South Africa in the 80s. You'll find guys saying they think the South should have won the Civil War. You'll see certain guys praising members of the Ku Klux Klan. And so the NRA selectively gets upset. If it's Cliven Bundy, as you pointed out, and it becomes a cause celeb because this guy rips us all off for $1 million in taxes and grazing fees and everything else. If it's Randy Weaver in where was it, Idaho, a white supremacist, they'll get up in arms. If it's David Koresh, who's was a cultist and was molesting kids, they'll get up in arms. And not to say that I wish those two incidents had turned out the way they did. I never want these incidents to become violent. But the point being that they're always there when somebody's rights are being trampled on if they're white. But the minute this happens in Ferguson, where we've got everything they've ever warned about, these guys coming in body armor, with 50 caliber rifles, sniper rifles pointed at people who haven't done anything, who are unarmed, rubber bullets, sound cannons, mace, pepper spray. They're shooting, tear gas into people's yards of their homes. I mean, where are they? And they're nowhere because that's not the constituency they appeal to. They really are a white civil rights organization, is what they call themselves, the longest-standing civil rights organization. If they added 4 white people at the end, which would probably work if you added that to the end of every sentence they utter, that would probably be more honest.
Like reading Chinese fortune cookies and
exactly
adding
like
that
that. When
you
used to add that nice little term in bed at the end, it's the same thing, but 4 white people will take care of it.
Right. 4 white people. Yeah. Now, I'm so old and I was political very early in high school.
Good
I'm
intro
so
that
old.
way.
I actually, that I actually remember when the NRA was for gun control. And that was at the time when the headlines were filled with African American groups who were saying, we're going to arm ourselves and protect ourselves. Now, I am saying there's a connection here potentially, but I'm asking, why is it, just speak to your point. And a lot of it, a lot of us say, well, the NRA has become increasingly political, increasingly right-wing radicalized and so on. But even decades ago, when the original Black Panthers were around and so on, they got pretty upset when minorities started talking about protecting themselves with weaponry. They were all of a sudden for gun control. Now that gun control will take guns out of the hands of Caucasian individuals, it seems like their position has changed. Am I somehow being unfair to them?
No, you're not. Look, they always are predominantly made up of white people, and attitudes of whites overall have gotten much more, tolerant, and much more we want to coexist, friends. The things have certainly changed in a lot of places since the 70s. So my guess is even in less radical whites back then, I'm sure were much less sympathetic to having African Americans carry guns. But even with that, if you think about even right-wing political figures, You know, you think about someone like Ronald Reagan, who in the great state of California that you live in, was amazingly who came out very strongly for gun control when the Black Panthers showed up in Sacramento and started carrying them around the state house because open carry was quite legal there at that time. So there's just no doubt, and you know this as well as I do. I mean, we could bring up these incidents. We compared Ferguson to Clive and Bundy. We can compare this guy, I can't think of his first name, Crawford, this terrible incident. It was here in Ohio. This African-American went into Walmart. He picked up a BB gun. The police showed up and shot him and killed him.
Right.
And there's now been a federal case by the DOJ, the Department of Justice has been open to look into this. Meanwhile, in Aurora, Colorado, where they've suffered unspeakable gun tragedy and then movie theater shooting, some dumb white kid who was about 18 or 19 took out his assault weapon and started walking through the streets. He got a nice talking to. He didn't get shot and killed. As all these other open carry, has there been one case where one of these guys has open carried in any of these places and they've been shot and killed by the police? Who's these white guys? No. It really is about race. It really is. I mean, even whenever African Americans have stepped forward to pick up guns, then you won't hear those rights being defended as you're not in Ferguson. And I will say one more thing quickly. I promise you that if we sent out a couple of African Americans tomorrow carrying assault weapons to a few wealthy suburban white neighborhoods and even a couple of rural white neighborhoods around the country, they would be shot by police. They wouldn't be welcomed in, and people wouldn't say, "Oh, you're just open carrying. That's great." There's a double standard here, like there are in so many other parts of our society.
And what's staggering to me is that it's so blatant, that double standard that you talk about, and that we can have, for example, a judge saying of a wealthy white person in his early 20s convicted of rape that prison would not be a beneficial experience for him, and so therefore let him off without a prison sentence. But, a gunshot to the head from a police officer is not a beneficial experience either, but Michael Brown is being tried in the media. So the double standard is just devastating to me and just shocking. And I guess maybe we can close with this about the National Rifle Association, because, it still has a reputation among middle-aged and older Americans, especially white Americans, to be clear, that, they were the guys that if you got a gun, they taught you about gun safety, and they wanted to make sure that everybody knew how to handle a weapon, almost apolitical. But I just want to maybe close on the theme of their extreme political. I've written about them a little bit, not nearly as much as you, but it seems to me now at this point they're almost a sales organization for gun manufacturers that want to capitalize on white terror and white hostility or hate in order to move product. And it seems that they're A, just politically nuts themselves, and B, doing whatever it takes to move product for their sponsors. Is that accurate in your mind, or oversimplistic, or where?
No, it really isn't.
In a minute.
It isn't. I'll say in a minute, very quickly. They are not what they were. I shot on a riflery team at camp, and I got those NRA medals. This was back in a time, 30-something years ago, when they cared about these kinds of things. They've become a front group for the gun manufacturers, let's call them what they are, for arms dealers that have a vibrant market here in the United States they want to keep. These guys pump money into them, and they've become a partisan, almost money laundering organization for the NRA, because people can give them money through their charity. For the Republican Party, excuse me. People can give them money through, give the NRA huge money, Koch brothers and others, and they spend it almost exclusively on Republican candidates. That is what they are today.
On Republican politics and fueling the kind of hatred that I would say indirectly leads to situations like we've seen in Ferguson. Cliff Schechter, as always, man, thanks so much for joining us. Stay on the case, and we appreciate you sharing your insights. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back with more about Ferguson. This is The Zero Hour.
You are listening to the We Act Radio Network, produced in Washington, D.C. Visit us online at weactradio.com or at youtube.com/weactradiodc.
And we're back on the Zero Hour with some more Ferguson-themed random news. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I don't dislike all technology. I've been called a Luddite and all sorts of things, even though I designed computer systems in a past life, even though I've been called a futurist and anthologized in a book of the 50 leading futurists in the world in the Rough Guide to the Future. That's what that book was. So, no, I'm not anti-future. I'm not anti-technology. And here's proof. Here's an application, a new app that I absolutely love. This is an article from Business Insider. The headline: 3 teenagers created an app to document police abuse. I love this story. Okay, and this shows the promise of technology as long as we fight to keep it democratized and don't let the billionaires and the Silicon Valley hacks hijack the technology that was created. Don't forget, on your government's dime, not by them. Okay, this is the headline. I'm just going to excerpt from the story a little bit. 3 teenagers from Georgia took the situation into their own hands. This is my words. Caleb Christian, 14, and his 2 sisters, Ima, who's 16, and Asha, who's 15, are rolling out an app called 5-0. Wow, what a great name, which lets users document police abuse and join together as a community to solve the problems raised by police abuse. 5-0. This is what I'm a Christian told Business Insider. We've been hearing about the negative instances in the news, most recently the Michael Brown case, and we always talk about these issues with our parents. They always try to reinforce that we should focus on solutions. It's important to talk about the issues, but they try to make us focus on finding solutions. That made us think, why don't we create an app to help us solve this problem? End quote. Boy, I love that. 5-0 lets users submit the details of any incident of police abuse and rate the specific officer. Man, if we can do it for Yelp, if we can rate people for other things, why not rate police officers? It has community boards for different counties so that users can communicate and plan responses to any difficulty with local law enforcement. So they want to collect data, bring it to community activists, the media, and then perhaps to their city officials as well, and say this is the situation. So, they also say this. They want to highlight not just negative, but also positive interactions. So you can rate police officers who are great to work with, who are great for the community too. They want good examples to serve as motivations for officers to do better. They are determined, these kids, to make a difference, says Business Insider. Caleb says you're never too young to learn, and you're never too young to make a difference. And you know what? You're never too old to be grateful for the innovation, creativity, and imagination of the United States and its young people, or to be grateful to the technology of the internet and computer systems, digital tech created with your tax dollars. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our special program on the continuing crisis in Ferguson, USA. We will be talking later on in the program with an organizer for Amnesty International, who is there on the ground. We will be talking with a U.S. divestment group about the relationship between climate change and the situation there. We will be talking about with the field organization. Reset, folks. Okay, we will be talking with the field organizer for Dream Defenders. That is kind of hard to say. And we'll be talking with other community leaders there on the ground in Ferguson. And before we get to it, I want to talk to you a little bit about a different kind of violence that affects our minority communities and our poor communities in the United States. And that is the slow violence. We've seen the rapid violence of gunshot wounds and other forms of assault, whatever the source. But there is a slow form of violence being inflicted on our low-income communities and minority communities as well, and that is a form of nutritional violence. We have learned through a recent study that Americans who receive food aid, who are by definition lower income, have much higher rates of diabetes and of high blood pressure than the U.S. population as a whole. Now, some of that, we're finding out, has to do with the strategies that low-income people and food insecure people have to take in order to address their financial situation and put food on the table. And food insecure, for those of you who don't know, that term means those who at some point in the past year have not known whether they would be able to put food on the table for their children or not, or who perhaps had difficulty actually putting food on the table. So a nonprofit group called Feeding America surveyed 60,000 people who use meal and grocery programs around the country for low-income Americans. And here's what they found out. Here are some of the strategies that hungry Americans use to make food last and to address food insecurity. One, they purchased inexpensive and unhealthy food. You get sometimes one of the racist diatribes you hear, for example, is, these minority people, they're overweight, and, if they were poor, why would they be heavy and all of that? Well, the fact is that especially in low-income communities, inner-city communities, for example, you don't have a lot of low-income healthy food choices. What you have is a lot of fast food. What you have is a lot of stores often overcharging even for snack items and fast food items. So 78.7% of low-income households purchased inexpensive or unhealthy food in order to get by, which has all sorts of long-term health implications. 56%, more than half, ate food past its expiration date, which can have, as you know, the severe health implications. More than half also, 52.5%, received help from family or friends. More than half, 51.7%, purchased food in dented or damaged packages, which can sometimes just be the result of shipping or storing, but at other times can mean that the food has gone bad. And when that happens, sometimes the composition of the air within it changes and it dents. So they also watered down food or drinks, 40% of them, sold or pawned personal property in order to put food on the table, 34.9%, or a little over a third. And so, here's what this tells us, among other things. It tells us that in the most prosperous country in the world, and we are an enormously wealthy country, we are focusing that wealth so exclusively on the richest among us that we have enormous food insecurity down the chain, and we have people whose health is being devastated by the food choices they're forced to make. Almost 80% saying that they bought unhealthy food because that was the only food they could afford. Now, what was the prevalence of diabetes and high blood pressure among people receiving food aid? 33.2%, or a third, suffered from diabetes, which is an extraordinary figure because for all Americans, that figure is 9.3%. And remember that all Americans includes poor people. So when you segmented it out, they are probably 4 times as likely to experience diabetes. High blood pressure, 57.8%, as opposed to a national average of 31%. Again, devastating figures. And these coping strategies, they don't happen on their own. They happen because we do not do enough to ensure that every American has a right to a healthy diet. So as we were watching the headlines about the tragic deaths of people in our minority communities and low-income communities, let us not forget the slow death and disease that comes from economic injustice, and let us keep that in our mind and resolve to do something about it and demand that something be done about it. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we're covering the situation in Ferguson and a special Ferguson USA report. Amnesty International is perhaps the oldest and certainly the best known of all the international human rights organizations, founded in London in 1961. Most people are familiar with the idea of Amnesty International sending observers to countries around the world in order to document human rights abuses and to provide local people there with options for how to respond and to drum up international support for justice and an end to these abuses. It might surprise a number of Americans to learn that Amnesty International has been on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, here in the United States, documenting the situation there. And joining us now is Ernest Coverson, who is a regional field organizer with Amnesty International USA. And Mr. Coverson, we thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, please, if you would, tell us how long you and Amnesty have been there and what you're finding.
Well, we've had staff to go in. We always have members there and local folks that live and reside in the Ferguson, St. Louis area, but we had a special delegation that went in on last Thursday, and we are staying until next Tuesday. And we have had two-pronged approach. One was an observant role as well as an organizing role. So we had members there, staff there that were observing the police, observing the situation, documenting any human rights abuses that took place. And then the second tier was a team of organizers that went in to help with organizing, working with the local community, working with organizations that have been doing a lot of work already on the ground, helping with some of the street medic work from the tear gas situations, and then just helping overall what we could assist in expertise on the ground.
Okay, well, we appreciate you certainly doing that. We're grateful for the work of Amnesty International there in Ferguson. And in terms of documenting human rights abuses, what have you found?
Well, we found that, the militarization of the police was a shock to us. Also, the right for peaceful protesting was sometimes up in the air. The police sometimes decided to move the crowd or stop the protesting going on, designated to a certain area of the street versus the freedom to move. And so those type of things we found. And then some of our researchers or observers on the ground also just talk to individuals to take cases, to take information, and we'll be doing some follow-up documentation after next week.
So when you say, most people, I think, or I shouldn't say most, but I'd say there's a lot of people in this country who aren't really following the Ferguson situation very closely, and they might have heard that, there was rock throwing or there was vandalism or something, looting, and then the police responded. So I think a lot of people, maybe if they're Fox News watchers or whatever, have gotten the impression that this is not really about peaceful demonstration, but, we know, because we've been covering it here at WEAC Radio Network, that in the 0 hour, we know that it's been primarily peaceful. And it sounds to me like you guys who are trained observers are finding the same thing, right? That we're seeing a very strong police response to peaceful demonstrations.
Correct. From the day we got on the grounds, the gas station called the QT that was burnt up, per se, was like ground zero. And so folks were there, peaceful protesting. Folks were there handing out food to the protesters, water to the protesters. Individuals were bringing dozens of roses to hand out to individuals, and the folks were driving by, giving, kudos to the folks that were there protesting. So it was very peaceful. Yes, there were instances in the evening or late night hours where there was some vandalism taking place, but 90%, 95% of the people and the time was there just doing peaceful protesting for justice for Mike Brown.
So what we're basically seeing is, one of the other things I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Coverson from Amnesty International, is that one of the things that struck me was, and I haven't heard it discussed a lot, but I think police officers are supposed to readily identify themselves in this country. I know when we had reporters arrested, which seems to me a classic human rights violation, we had a police officer answering the phone who would not identify himself and give his full name. I believe we've had police officers concealing their badges and so on. Have you seen that as well?
Yes. Well, the majority of the police, as well as I would say, like with the majority of the protesters, were nice, were amenable to the situation, was, there to protect the the city as well as the protesters. So the majority of them are there. But I would say in any case, you have some protesters and you have some police officers that go beyond what their duty is, decide to take, law in their own hand or their own interpretation of the law and do things that may not be legal or helpful for the situation.
So, and in those cases, of course, we're supposed to have processes and procedures in this nation to address that. So how would you assess the situation now? The newspaper headlines say things have been somewhat, I've heard the word peaceful described to talk about Ferguson last night or two. How would you describe the situation today as of Friday?
It is, as it has been, during all the other days, it's quiet. It's, people are out protesting again. Our local organizing community is still organizing to, help out and rebuild after all of this, what it's going to look like after all the cameras are gone. And so continuing that work of organizing is taking place.
So we had the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, come to Ferguson. And do you think how would you assess the role of the United States Justice Department in this situation and of the Attorney General? And do you think any of the improvements have to do with perhaps their involvement?
The federal government needs to come in and make sure that justice is done. I mean, Attorney General Holder was in town on yesterday, and he, met with the family, met with individuals, and so hopefully they will continue to monitor and work to make sure justice is brought for the Brown family. And that's the biggest piece that we can, reiterate.
So I wanted to ask you, Ernest Coverson, you're a trained regional field organizer with Amnesty International USA. You're there in Ferguson. You told another outlet that the United States must be honest with itself about this situation. What is it that you think the United States is maybe not, as a whole, not being completely honest with itself about the Ferguson situation?
Well, that it is, there is an issue that, there is a racial component to the issue. There's an honesty to the issue, and that we need to, as a country, recognize that and deal with it, and not just hope that it'll go away, because it may be another instance of this somewhere else in the country as well. So we need to be honest in that sense.
So there may be another instance because of the militarization of the police, because there are a number of communities where the police don't have a close enough relationship with the community and that sort of thing?
Correct. Just the community and the police relationship is not there in other communities. And so we need to, address that as we're moving forward as a country.
So let me ask you another question. I think you also told a news organization that you were shocked, that it was shocking a little bit when you came to Ferguson and the situation along that West Florissant Street there and so on, that you were a little shocked about that. What would you tell us was shocking about it?
Just the biggest piece was the militarization of the police. To see full riot gear, to see armored vehicles, to see police officers walking down the street, with assault rifles and that type of thing is something you see typically, on news outlets in war-torn countries or countries that are at war. But this was right here in a small community outside of St. Louis. You saw that same type of situation.
Right. And now I mentioned in my introduction that Amnesty International might be the oldest, certainly the best known international human rights organization, founded in London in 1961, so more than 50 years ago, more than half a century ago. And I'm also mentioned that people might be a little surprised to know that Amnesty International was in an American city this week. How often has Amnesty International, if ever, before now, been brought in to look at a situation in a United States city like this? Right.
Well, we've always been here in the United States. We were in Georgia with the Troy Davis execution prior to and even after the Troy Davis execution. We had a delegation of staff and members there working tirelessly to stop the execution, and then working with the community post-execution. So it's not totally new for us to do this. We've been here. We will continue to be in Ferguson as well. And so, correct, typically what is seen as us in other countries around the world, and we've been there. We want to make sure that we bring human rights home here in the United States and monitor things that are taking place in our country as well.
Well, it's a shame it's come to that, isn't it? And I guess for our last question but I'm glad you're doing your work. I guess my last question to you would be, what do you see? What do you see in the next week or in the next few days? What do you foresee there?
Well, we foresee the community continuing to do the good work that a lot of the local organizations are doing in training the people on the ground, training the young folk especially that are out there protesting, how to take that energy into something positive to make some real meaningful change in their community. So I see that continuing on for the next week. We will patiently await the rendering from the grand jury, which started on yesterday, I believe, and here, to see what their findings will be as we wait for that piece to take place as well. So those are the upcoming over the next week, and making sure that the people continue to have the right to peaceful protest, that the community is organized, and that we continue to support our partner organizations that are on the ground, continually to do this work every day.
Well, thanks so much for joining us and giving us that update and telling us about your work there. We've been talking with Ernest Coverson, who is with Amnesty International USA, and I imagine if folks Google Amnesty International USA, they can find out more about the good work they've been doing. And Mr. Coverson, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And as Mr. Coverson said, there will be more coming up in the next week, particularly as the grand jury releases its findings. There's been a lot of talk there on the ground in Ferguson that the local DA has not been an enthusiastic supporter of getting to the bottom of this situation, but we will learn more about that as that develops. And of course, we will keep you posted here on We Act Radio Network and the Zero Hour. This is our special report on Ferguson, USA. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is Deirdre Smith, who is Strategic Partnership Coordinator with the great environmental group 350.org. And she has an interesting perspective on current events. Let's say she has written a piece for 350.org, How Racial Justice is Integral to Confronting Climate Crisis. Deirdre, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you bet. So tell us, how is racial justice integral to confronting the climate crisis?
Well, I think that the idea that racial justice is a siloed fight that actually only impacts the people at the bottom of a power totem pole is an illusion. That a lot of the militarized violence and tactics of cultural oppression that are used in racial injustice are issues that have to be confronted in order to also do the work and resistance that it takes to build a world that isn't run by corporations and fossil fuels. And so I think that's one piece. Yeah.
And then so what you're really speaking to, and I think I share that. I talk about this. I think there's an interconnectedness that the patterns to current events that people don't see. In other words, they see the events in Ferguson, but they don't realize, for example, that the militarization of police forces around the country might have something to do with corporate interests profiting from the sale of defense weaponry and all of that. And that those same few sets of interests, whether it's through political contributions, interlocking boards of directors, investors, whatever, are closely allied with the political and corporate and financial interests that are ruining our economy. You have the Koch brothers, you have, all of that. You have the Koch brothers who are major polluters, distorting the political process with their money and staffing or stuffing, I should say, state legislatures and other local governments as well as national governments with their sympathizers through ALEC and others. So you really have, in other words, I think what you're calling for is, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, is common cause between people who are fighting these special interests in order to protect the planet and the environment and people who are fighting these special interests, for example, in order to keep the teenagers in their community safe.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And I think a piece of it is truly being able to understand the interconnectedness of the powers that be. Following the money, following the power is definitely a huge piece of it. I also think that the cultural narrative that dehumanizes and creates any group in our society as this other group that allows the U.S. mainstream to feel unaffected by the militarized violence happening in these vulnerable communities is really sets up a division that doesn't allow us to leverage our collective power towards solutions. So, and it's a really difficult, it's a difficult thing because there are so many issues, and often when people start to think about intersectionality, it becomes overwhelming. But I think why Ferguson, the community of Ferguson, putting a call out for solidarity is a specific opportunity for us to talk about how and when to show up. But I think the thing that's been really getting me around the media and cultural narrative around Ferguson is really that dehumanization and division narrative that continues to keep us feeling as though we will never be and we are not impacted by these issues. And at the same time, I think that we shouldn't only act when an issue impacts us.
Right.
Personally.
Right. And, you wrote about that. You wrote that, about the dehumanization, how you saw the same image. We all saw those images after Hurricane Katrina that, in the name of restoring order, you wrote, my family and their community were demonized as looters and dangerous. And so, sure, anytime someone's marginalized like that and their legitimate needs are dismissed in favor of that demonization. So isn't this partially, I think there are two sides to it. I think one is we've got to challenge that narrative of demonization and making everybody the other so that we can come together. But I think the other piece of it is that I think specifically the environmental movement has been perhaps intentionally, there's a narrative that's set up that says, well, that's somehow in conflict with what minority people or lower income people, for example, might need because, well, they need jobs and we can only get jobs through compromising the environment, which isn't true. And you and I know that's true. But I think there's been a real, I'd be curious your thoughts, but I think there's been a definite and conscious attempt to get those two movements, let's say economic and civil rights justice and the environmental movement against one another instead of, in creating a climate where they can come together.
Right. Yeah, it's a scary thought. I think for some, what would happen if we were really able to leverage our fight together. I mean, I also think that the climate movement, and I say the climate movement, but there are so many different organizations and groups with sort of different ideas about how we do this. But I think largely, if you look at the history of the environmental movement too, it hasn't just been a division. I think culturally, sure, socially, sure, there's been a division imposed. But really, I think there's been a severe disparity within the climate movement, from global north to global south, from the most impacted to the least impacted, white folks to black and brown folks. And I think it's a moment, it's been a moment, and it's particularly crucial now for the climate movement to look at why we would allow that kind of division within our own movement. And I'm not just talking about intersectionality, although I think it helps those issues. But I think, Andrea Smith, indigenous woman academic, talks a lot about how divisions in society are really kept in place because those of us who have access to a little bit more power by participating in another division. So, for instance, if we're able to feel like we have a lot of power by being, say, affluent white folks, it's really hard, the thought of giving up that power to show up for another, divided pillar of society. And so I think that's brilliant and something that we really need to be challenging ourselves to understand right now, that it's actually not giving up power to show up for other groups. It's building power, it's building trust, and it's building a possibility of actually leveraging the kind of power we need to create, the largest paradigm shift in human history. And I think so.
And I think that, I think that's a fantastic point. I mean, I think that I think when we're divided, we not only compromise our own power, but in a sense, we seal our own fate, because when it comes to the environment, we're all in this together. And if we allow ourselves to be divided, in the end, it doesn't matter. I mean, even the most privileged white person will lose out in the end on a damaged and dying planet. And so the way out is for all of us to come together. I love that message, and I thank you so much for writing this piece and for joining us on the program.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing great coverage of what's happening on the ground in Ferguson.
You bet. I appreciate that. That was Deirdre Smith, who is a U.S. divestment organizer with 350.org. You can learn more about their organization at 350.org, 350.org. And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow. This is our special report on Ferguson, USA. Joining us now is Melanie Stamp. She is the coordinator of Freedom Side Network and the director of strategic partnerships and youth engagement for the Working Families Organization. She is, I believe, on the ground there as part of Dream Defenders in the Ferguson area, but if not, she will set me right. Nalini Stamp, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm the former strategic director of strategic partnerships and youth engagement at Working Families Organization. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, but the real question is, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I am not in. I'm no longer in Ferguson, but still communicating to people on the ground there and trying to help support because a lot of people nationally have been looking into, youth who have been calling and saying, how do we support Ferguson? Organizations, both who have been around for a long time and new organizations that have been born in the last couple of years, have been asking about what has been going on the ground in Ferguson. And it's a lot, but it's a lot. There are a couple of things that is needed in Ferguson that they've asked for. Medics from people who are particularly street medics who have experience with some of the stuff on the ground that's happening, experience with chemical, warfare like tear gas and mace and pepper spray in a large combination. They're looking for attorney support whenever possible. And other folks are telling people, they're actually telling people to organize in their own communities, stay where they're at so they can organize locally so we can really handle this problem at hand, which is not just the exercising of First Amendment rights, but it's the root of the problem. There was every 28 hours, according to a report by the Malcolm X grassroots movement, a black man is shot and killed by an officer.
And I think you find, by and large, I mean, this is the invisible tragedy, invisible to most people outside those communities. That's going on across the country, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and our philosophy here on this show is everything that's going on in this country right now. Every issue is a youth issue because younger people are going to inherit this world. So all of its economic and environmental and political conditions are youth issues. But this really is a youth issue, right? Because, I mean, when we talk about a black man being shot and killed every 48 hours, we're talking by and large about young black men, aren't we?
I don't know exactly what the report says, but overwhelmingly it is young black men that are shot and killed every 28 hours and by a police officer or an officer of the law in this country. Mm-hmm.
So when you went out to Ferguson and now when you're going back, I mean, obviously we need things like attorneys and before we let you go, we'll talk about where people can go to, get more information, maybe help. So we need people like attorneys, we need people like medics and so on. And by the way, something we mentioned earlier, but worth repeating, is that the use of CS gas or tear gas, both of which I believe have been used. We had our own guys tear gas. They kept the canister. CS gas is actually in warfare forbidden by international law, but police are allowed to use it on our own people. So you need medics, you need attorneys, but in terms of organizing and helping communities organize themselves, what in particular did you find when you went out to Ferguson?
You mean the local community there, or in terms of organizing in across the country?
Well, both, because I would guess that the local communities' needs reflect those of communities around the country.
Yeah. So, the local community has been trying to uplift the youth who have been organizing. There have been young people like Tori, who I did not get to meet because unfortunately he was locked up for a full day, and who have been organizing themselves. Like people were self-organizing. The community of Ferguson was self-organizing. There was also organizations like Missouri's Organizing for Reform and Empowerment there, who have been an institution in St. Louis for a while, as well as the Organization for Black Struggle that has been there for a while. But the key has been, and this is from Montego from the Organization of Black Struggle said, none of us have ever faced something in this manner, in this way. And this is all stuff that we're dealing with for the first time. Not the actual murder, but the repression that's happening from police because people are assembling, because they are sick and tired of being sick and tired. There have been organizations like Dream Defenders and the Black Youth Project, BYP 100, who have gone in to show help and some support to give some tips in organizing Black youth, because those are what those organizations primarily work with. And then across the country, people have been asking and reaching out of, how do we support this? What is it going to take for it to end? Because not just, it's not, we saw two public murders in the last month, with the death and murder of Eric Garner in my hometown of Staten Island, New York, and also Mike Brown in Ferguson, John Crawford in Ohio, in Beaver Creek, Ohio, in a Walmart where the Ohio State Student Association organized to make sure that the Attorney General released the tapes to their parents. So there is organizing happening locally across the country. This morning, Charlene Carruthers, the national coordinator for BYP 100, and you can find that at byp100.org, wrote an article saying what people can do locally in their own communities if they are frustrated with the system at hand. There are things that people can do at the local level, like city council, like legislation on the city council level. If you live in a big city like Chicago, like Charlene does, right? People are calling for front-facing cameras. Some national demands is that the Department of Justice look into habitually bad police departments that have a record number of arrests, murders, and killings to have front-facing cameras, which the police commissioner of New York, Bill Bratton, said that it would actually be safer for officers to have front-facing cameras because it shows what they do and do not do, right? So there's a lot of things that are going on, and people can do stuff in their local community around this. And, just another thing about the front-facing cameras, the other day, about a week ago after the Eric Garner murder, the public advocate of New York City, Letitia James, put out, some budgeting around, let's do a pilot program on front-facing cameras and let's see if this works. And then places where they do have this, in other countries, I don't really have the stats for it, but apparently it has decreased the number of killings and murders of people because of the camera, because they know they're on camera.
And for people who don't know, the front-facing camera, actually the officer would wear it, right? So people would actually see more or less what the officer sees and would be able to track the officer's behavior. And so we would have no situation like Michael Brown's death where there's a haze of misinformation or confusion. We would know precisely his position at the time of death and so on. Now, we got about a minute left.
Know everything. Yes.
Right. So in the minute we've got left, Nalini Stamp, let's do a little instant micro-organizing right here. If people want to know more and want to help, where can they go?
Absolutely. People can visit the Organization for Black Struggles website, and more Missourians Organizing for Reform and Empowerment Facebook for updates, live updates, how they can help and support a bail fund is on that Facebook page. And there is going to be the people of Ferguson are calling for a national day of action this Tuesday, because his Mike Brown's funeral is going to be on Monday, and so people are calling for a national day of action on Tuesday to go to the Department of Justice and support the national demands that are out there. A website is coming up soon. They're working on it right now, but as soon as we have the information, we'll let you all know what the website link is and when it goes live.
And as soon as we have it, we'll push that out to our listeners and readers. So we've been talking with Nalini Stamp, who's coordinator for the Freedom Side Network and has been on the ground in Ferguson helping to unite the efforts of individual communities with that of laterally with other communities across the country. Nalini, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
You bet. I'm Richard. RJ Eskow will be back after this. This is The Zero Hour.
.org.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the We Act Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour and our special program today on Ferguson, USA. And, I guess as we begin to enter our final hour of the program, the word that comes to mind is connectedness. We've lost somewhere along the way, we've lost that sense of connectedness. At different periods of history, it's stronger, and other periods of history, perhaps it is less strong. But there is a connectedness. And if there is a theme to the program, it is this. It is that whether you are white or black, whether you are wealthy or poor, even if you are one of the 0.01%, there is an inescapable connectedness between the young people of Ferguson who are at risk for their lives, the young people of our inner cities, and the black men of our inner cities, as we've talked about on the show. A study showed that one black man was killed in a shooting incident a police incident every 28 hours. It may seem as if for example, if you're a wealthy white person, as if what happens in a community like Ferguson is of no personal interest to you. Nothing could be further from the truth, although there are those who would have you believe that for their own short-term interests. The fact is this. The fact is that the economic and political interests which have militarized the police of Ferguson and police forces all around the country are intensely interconnected, both financially and politically, and in many cases personally as well, with the interests who are working to damage the environment and to undermine any meaningful attempt to slow down the damage that we're doing to our planet. The most extreme example of that, as one of our guests discussed earlier, was the situation in Katrina, where an American city, it's almost unthinkable, an American city devastated by entirely predictable climate events created by climate change. And yet when that happened, we chose not to come together to help them, but many of us chose to demonize the people of that city, either by calling them looters and spreading false rumors about super predators among the African American community there in New Orleans. We chose to demonize them in that way. We chose to demonize them by somehow blaming the people of New Orleans for living so close to the water. Again, separation where the reality is connected. Is connectedness, because they came for New Orleans and I didn't speak up, and eventually they came for me. There will be, sooner or later, no escape from the consequences of global warming. The sooner we realize that, the better. And except for a very few among us, there will be no escape from the soon-to-be irreversible effects of oligarchical wealth that Thomas Piketty wrote about in his book Capital in the 21st Century. There will be no escape from the predations of disability and old age if we dismantle the Social Security system in order to provide additional tax convenience and tax breaks for the wealthy. We are in this together, black and white, rich and poor, young and old, employed and unemployed, and ultimately, in the end, American or member of the global community. There is no separation among us. That is another lesson, that the militarization we've seen in Ferguson, as guest after guest has told us, resembles the militarization we've seen in other parts of the world, as seen by Amnesty International, as seen by Reverend Sekou, who will be joining us again, as seen by others, as seen by myself traveling the world. If we are in this together, and as soon as we unite in common interests, working people, poor people, minority people, all of us who have to breathe the oxygen on this planet and live in a habitable atmosphere, the better. This is one struggle. This is one interconnectedness. Time is running short. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now, we're very pleased to have back with us Reverend Osagifo Uhuru Sekou, who is a Freeman Fellow with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He is pastor for formation and justice at the First Baptist Church in Jamaica Plain. He is down there in Ferguson, and certainly has been. He was born and attended high school in St. Louis, Missouri, so Ferguson is his home territory, and he joins us once again on the Zero Hour. Reverend Sekou, thanks so much for joining us.
It's such a pleasure to be back with you, dear brother. Thank you for keeping alive the tradition of the Fourth Estate.
Thank you, sir, so much. And first, before we get any further, I heard you were having some health problems, and I'd like to know, are you well? We're certainly thinking of you, praying for you. How are you?
I am well, running from the police and tear gas for 3 or 4 nights in a row in what we call church shoes is not the best ideal and the best thing for your back. No,
it's not, and certainly we wish you a speedy recovery from that. And I'll just start by saying I spent a little bit of time as a musician backing up church choirs, and I do recall a song about traveling shoes. Maybe we ought to get you a pair.
I did. I got me a pair of old beat up New Balance, so I got me a pair of traveling shoes.
All right, good. That's good. That's good news. And now I do want to talk to you, Reverend Sekou, about you've been working with you've worked with young people and you've been down there, and one of the things I think people struggle with in Ferguson is, even those of us who I think our hearts are in the right place and we recognize it's an injustice and we recognize that something must be done, but I feel as if the country needs a moral framework, moral guidance, moral context for what's going on here. And I feel that as this situation extends, how do we help people understand what the framework for justice needs to be in a situation like Ferguson?
Well, I think the framework of justice is the same framework of justice that we've always wrestled with inside the American empire, particularly for those people of African descent who have essentially kept America on life support, kept it alive in various ways over the past since I'd sojourned into this place. And so one of the moral frameworks that emerges for me out of my narrow Christian context is the least of these. Such what you have done unto the least of these, so you have done it unto me. When I was hungry, you fed me not. When I was naked, you clothed me not. When I was in prison, you visited me not. And so at this moment when black youth have some of the highest unemployment rates in the country, and where African Americans have been in a perpetual state of economic depression for the past 5 decades, combined with in Ferguson, Missouri, there's been a doubling of unemployment from 2000 to 2012. The median income is $36,000, and 1 in 4 people live in poverty, and people, and all of them are struggling to make $1 out of 15 cents. It is the unfinished business of Dr. King, that great moral vision that was given to us through the people he struggled alongside. And so as a result of that, we find ourselves in a situation where we must be able to keep track of the misery of everyday people and highlight their suffering and their misery, and that what is happening with us now in what we see happening in Ferguson now is a reflection of a deeply problematic and amoral framework. And so part of that moral vision is, how do we get people access to a decent and living wage? How do we beat back the various forms of police abuse? Question that the murder of Mike Brown reflected to us. And so part of that moral framework includes an economic just one, as well as a demilitarization of American police forces.
And you use that phrase, amoral framework, that there is an amoral framework which would preserve situations like that in Ferguson, and occasionally erupts in the kind of police militarization behavior we've seen there. And I would ask you, I guess my observation, yes, it's amoral. I would also argue that except for a tiny, tiny percentage of the population, you might call the oligarchy or whatever, it's also an illusion for the white community. And I mean, it was something I wanted to get your thoughts. I was talking about it in the monologue. I think there's this illusion among, let's say, middle class white people, even relatively prosperous white people or people of any ethnicity that get a little bit of money, that somehow that's not us, that's somebody else. But when you have a society where there's so much economic injustice, where there's such a lack of opportunity, a house divided cannot stand. And so I'm just struggling here for a way. I'm asking you for guidance here for how can I even tell people who might think that it's somebody else who's suffering and dying on the streets of Ferguson, that no, that's you, and that if you distance yourself from that moral struggle, you're not only being amoral, but in the long run, you're going to harm yourself.
Well, I think part of that understanding of what a moral framework looks like and the contradictions that white brothers and sisters are undergoing is has to do with what W.E.B. Du Bois in his text Black Reconstruction, published at the turn of the century, argues that there is a psychological wage of whiteness. And so even though white brothers and sisters are catching hell, many of them still do not fully understand or benefit rather from the psychological wages of whiteness, in that they do not see them, even though they are poor, they are suffering, they don't vote in their best interest, and at least they are not niggas. So it is just not simply about white elites not understanding. It is about a nation that is not understanding. It has created a level of public policy that has been malformed and ultimately not in the best interest of the nation. And so it is getting beyond that psychological wage of whiteness. This is not an insurmountable task. There are great white brothers and sisters who have done that, like yourself and many, many others. Viola Lazo, who laid her life down in Selma, Alabama, the late Will Campbell. I mean, there's a tradition of white folks who've been able to see beyond the psychological wages of whiteness and find access to something greater than that as a moral framework. And then, the reality is, if we take something like Occupy, right, one way, almost glib way I've understood Occupy is to understand it as white folks have figured out that the system don't even work for them.
Well, I think that's right, and this gets back to this theme of a system that's really not is only working for the very, very few right now, and the idea that if I want to make the choice to listen to Fox News and be convinced that Clive Bundy is my hero, and the people in Ferguson are just somebody that I need to call out the army to protect me from, that in the end I'm not only forsaking my responsibility as a moral citizen of this country and of the world, but I am also economically and socially shooting myself in the foot, aren't I?
Well, I think it is more fundamental than that. It's not just simply shooting oneself in the foot. It is also a reality of moral injury, if you will, that white brothers and sisters are going through, and being able to create a kind, not necessarily empathy. And we're just not simply talking about individual white folks, right? We're talking about a system, a set of economic arrangements that facilitate various forms of alienation and isolation. And so it's just not about individual white people, but more about the ways in which a system of government, which, if you look at the passage of, say, the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, 64 and 65, respectively, if you took a national poll on those issues, the majority of white brothers and sisters wouldn't have supported it. So it's the question of a kind of prophetic few who are willing to seize public imagination, transform, and at their best transform public policy. And so it's about a system and those who feel called. Now, I am not a vanguardist. I don't know who those people are. I don't know what their class standing in. I think they'll be multi-class, multiracial, multi-gendered, will come to make America be to what it's been called to be. But I do know that something has to change, and that perhaps Ferguson and that the blood of Michael Brown has watered the soil for potential transformation of America.
Well, beautifully said, and we're going to, if that's all right with you, we'll take a quick break to just talk for a few minutes more. We're talking with Reverend Osagifu Sekou in Ferguson. This is Richard RJ. We'll be right back after this. This is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour talking with Reverend Osagifu Sekou about the situation in Ferguson and about the context, the moral context. But let's just take a break, if we might, for a moment and talk about, Reverend Sekou, what is your read of the situation there, the mood there? I know we've had the Attorney General there since you and I spoke last. We've got next week, we're looking forward to perhaps the release of the grand jury report and so on. How do you feel things are right there now?
I think we are really. We are in a pitched struggle. Highly militarized forces on the street, and young people who will not back down. They should be celebrated and honored. Their behavior. There's been a lot of emphasis on the small acts of violence. People talk about the property attacks on property as though it is more important than the attack on Michael Brown and the attack on civil liberties, the attack on freedom of the press, and the attack on the right to assembly. So there are several attacks that are going on and consistent, but the people show these wonderful young people consistently putting their bodies on the line, constantly raising the questions, even though guns are put on them. And in fact, the extra police presence actually is what causes the violence. They agitate and aggravate and exacerbate the situation by being there in their riot gear and giving the level of abuse that is happening to the people. And so there are several sectors organizing. There's large coalition. There's a large local and national coalition. And so we are in a situation whereby there are significant forms of social movement at work, and that those various levels of organizing are coalescing.
Now, as that happens, I know that you're there representing, among other things, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And how do we advance the spirit of reconciliation? I mean, it is, I struggle to put myself in the mindset of the policeman who climbs into the armored vehicle or points the gun at peaceful protesters or journalists and threatens them and curses them out. I mean, how do we reconcile? Are they driven by fear? Are they driven by anger? Is it all of the above? And is it really even our responsibility to be concerned about their side of the equation?
Well, I am by no means willing to, or have the capacity to, rather, enter into the mind of someone pointing an M16 at a 16-year-old. I don't understand it. But I do know that there is a tradition of people who have resisted it. And I think the jump toward reconciliation and peace is often what is articulated, particularly by religious creatures, but not doing the hard work of justice. Darren Wilson needs to be he needs to be indicted and convicted. There needs to be a demilitarization of the police. There needs to be a civilian review board of policing agencies. And so, and this is in part the demands that the Hands Up Coalition is calling for here in Ferguson and the St. Louis area. And so, and that will only happen, that would not happen without a pitched battle, a pitched struggle for justice. Non-violently, at their minimum, they have more guns than we do. And then ethically, we don't want to repeat that kind of cycle of violence, which is with the police and the policing agencies are continually going. And then one of the shameful things about the visit of Attorney Eric Holder and the president, by extension, is his celebration of Ron Johnson's increased militarization upon children in Ferguson. It is quite shameful, and this may prove to be Obama's Hurricane Katrina.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because in the opener to the show, I pointed out that people were outraged that the president went golfing after the kidnap and murder of the journalist by ISIS, which certainly was a tragic and awful and horrible thing. But I found it incongruous that nobody was talking about the president or anyone else going golfing while we had American children being confronted by a militarized police force on the streets of an American city.
Well, I mean, that has everything to do with, we pray for the dear brother journalist's family and the tragedy of that loss and the attack upon the free press by ISIS, but also there's an attack on the free press here in the United States. And that I pray that the emphasis on this of the death of our dear brother Foley, I believe is his name, that the vicious beheading of him on television and all of that is what warranted the kind of attention that has gotten, versus the fact that if it is black bodies that are being politically decapitated and existentially kidnapped, that those black bodies don't carry the same amount. But I'm pretty sure the parents of Brother Foley understand that fully, that the preciousness of their son is the same preciousness that Leslie McPadden holds for her children.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because I think that may be a way to carry them for me to carry the message, to point out that horror and that grief that so many people feel in a situation like poor Mr. Foley, the tragic situation. Now imagine that happening every other day, or more frequently, to a young person, much younger perhaps than Mr. Foley. And perhaps you can get a sense of the grief that people are experiencing, because I think it's a breaking down of that otherness, that sense that this is happening to somebody else. So I guess I know you have to go, and I'm certainly concerned about you making sure to rest that back of you too. But after that injury, but you have any final thoughts for us before we let you go back to your good work there?
Well, we pray that your listeners will engage in critical analysis, that they will pay attention to what independent media is having to say, that they will not demonize poor black children. We ask that people be continually put pressure on through social media and other forms of communication, that we need Officer Wilson to be indicted and prayerfully convicted as a form of justice for this community, and that we will continue to articulate a vision of the world that the promise of democracy was not lost outside the Canfield apartment with the brutal murder of Mike Brown.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Again, all our prayers and thoughts go with you and your health problem, and thank you for all the good work you're doing down there. We've been talking with Reverend Osagifu Seku there on the ground in Ferguson. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bless you, dear.
I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We will be right back after this. And by the way, before we go, just a quick moment to mention, there you have it. The life of a child shot in the head is every bit as precious, and the loss is every bit as painful as that of a young man tragically beheaded overseas. I couldn't make the point better myself. Again, I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
You are listening to the We Act Radio Network, produced in Washington, D.C. Visit us online at weactradio.com or at youtube.com/weactradiodc.
And we are back on the Zero Hour. Again, I want to talk a little bit about what technology is doing to help us as well as cause us problems. The one thing we haven't heard a lot about in the Ferguson situation is the use of drones. We've seen it in other community policing situations. On this program, we've even played you the video and the audio of a drone being destroyed by hockey fans in Los Angeles after it got too close to the crowd, and they threw a sweatshirt at it and brought it down and destroyed it. I mean, people really dislike drones, and I would say that is because of an instinctive understanding of the ways in which this technology can be used to suppress our privacy and our individual rights. So we talk about drones a fair amount on this program. I'm not saying they should always be opposed. Obviously, they've done good work rescuing hikers and so on, but they represent a significant threat to our civil liberties if used improperly. So far, they have not played heavily in the Ferguson story, but they have certainly appeared in other policing stories and, of course, in military actions around the world. So, again, the inventiveness of the American people and people around the world, we don't want to restrict it to America, is in responding to technology is sometimes fascinating to watch. So there is a new development, a new product called the anti-drone tent. The anti-drone tent is a small construction of emergency blankets which block infrared sensing, making it and whatever is underneath it presumably invisible to drones, because drones rely, of course, on infrared sensors more. They have cameras as well, but when they're at the higher levels, they're using infrared sensors. So here we have an example of technology, drones, being countered by other technology, the anti-drone tent, which is currently, by the way, if you're interested for yourself or a friend, the anti-drone tent is on display at drone camping at Mediamatic. So if you Google that, drone camping at Mediamatic, you will be able to find it. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, it occurred to me the other day watching television, there's something about somebody going off in the wilderness to hide. You can't go off in the wilderness and hide anymore, but you can if you have a drone tent. So do I endorse it? Would I not in all circumstances? Obviously, I wouldn't be happy if an escaped killer or something got his hands on one of these. But let us not forget that what humanity creates, humanity can counter. And that's just a random thought for your random news segment. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
Our children are exposed to violence every day in their neighborhoods, in their schools, even in their own homes.